I'd like to issue you all a warm welcome. It's very, very good to see so much enthusiasm for climate change initiatives in the community. And a warm welcome to Councillor Bendel. And a warm welcome to you all. So this is Mosman Council's community consultation workshop on mitigation. There's going to be two more workshops to follow this, one on adaptation and the other one on futures. So it's lovely to see you here. I'm Dr. Ruth Irwin. I've been working for Mosman Council for about 4 or 5 months now, doing the lead on climate change since Mosman Council declared a climate emergency in November 2019. My background is in climate change and social transitions. So I'm very interested in both the science and how we start to, as a community, engage and reduce our emissions and figure out how we live a life, a modern life that doesn't create climate change. So that's my background. I wrote my PhD on that about 20 odd years ago, and I've been mostly teaching in a university setting ever since. So this is my first foray into council. But this is where, you know, the rubber hits the road. So this is actually a really satisfying job for me because it's where things actually engage in a very meaningful, real manner. So the way that this workshop is going to work is I will talk to some degree to begin with about climate change and the science and the policy background. That's going to be very interactive, so you feel free to, you know, wave your hand at me and I'll engage. And then we're going to do some workshopping. So you as small groups will be thinking about mitigation projects and the process. I'll lead you through a process, and that's going to come up with some data, and that's what the council is going to take away and make sure that we include in our strategic planning. So that's the idea of this 2-hour workshop. Okay, so to start off with, here is a very interesting graph. This is using ice core sampling and from the Antarctic. So basically what they've done is they've looked at the carbon dioxide that's in the ice cores going back 800,000 years to make this graph, which has a very accurate rendition of how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere and how warm the planet was. So you can see that there are two lines there. The top line, the blue one, is about what we call parts per million volume of carbon dioxide emissions equivalent in the atmosphere, and the bottom line is the temperature of Antarctica at the time that there was that much emissions in the atmosphere. So you can see that it's got a very close correlation between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the temperature of the planet. And if you go right to the very end of the graph, you can see where we are right now. So right today we're at 416 parts per million volume. And the last time we were at 416 or even anywhere above 400 parts per million volume was when the dinosaurs became extinct at the end of the Pleistocene period. So it's a very serious situation that we're in. Again, this is just scientific data. This is taken from Hawaii, where they send balloons into the upper stratosphere and they measure how much carbon dioxide is in the very top stratosphere of the atmosphere. And you can see that the little pink line goes up and down, up and down. When it's at its peak, that's in the northern hemisphere summer, and that's when industrial movements in the northern hemisphere is more intense. In winter, people tend to calm down and do less. And so you'll find that it's higher in the northern hemisphere summer than it is in the northern hemisphere winter. So that's why it goes up and down to that degree. And you can see that despite all efforts, the amount of carbon dioxide is accumulating. And I think that's a really important thing to know, because we talk quite a lot about how many emissions we've put out this year, but what people fail to realise is that it's accumulating year on year on what has gone before. And so the Earth is capable of absorbing a certain amount of carbon dioxide through the photosynthesis of plants and seaweed and things like that, and also the microbes in the soil. So those are the three ways in which the planet actually absorbs carbon dioxide back and turns it back into carbon. But that's a very small amount compared to the amount that we are emitting into the atmosphere. So it's accumulative, and some of the gases that we put into the atmosphere take well over 1,000 years to come back out again. I'm just going to go through this one very briefly, but that just gives you an idea of the kinds of gases that are out there and the extent to which they are out there. So the bottom one, carbon dioxide, is basically from fossil fuels. That's coal, petrol, diesel, that sort of thing. And the blue line, you can see 1990 is the line in the sand that when we all joined the Kyoto Protocol, 1990 was the benchmark year. We were all supposed to be 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. And instead, we are 43% above 1990 levels at this point in time. And actually that graph was made in 2018, so it's slightly out of date. So this is a mitigation workshop, and I just wanted to make it really, that we were clear about the difference between mitigation and adaptation. So we'll go over adaptation in the next workshop. Mitigation is just reducing the amount of gas, reducing the emissions. It's pretty simple. So it's not adapting to the new norm. It's not adapting to a heating world. We'll deal with that in the next workshop. This one is how can we reduce the emissions that we put into the atmosphere. And the other part of mitigation is that there are some greenhouse sinks. In other words, the more trees we plant or the more seagrass that we allow to grow, they will help to absorb carbon dioxide. So there's two kind of elements to mitigation. One is reduce emissions, and the other is plant more trees. Now this is a very, very important graph, and I'm going to leave it up when we have our discussion a bit later on. So greenhouse gas, there is only a small number of greenhouse gases. It's not all gases. And these are the bulk of them. And on the right-hand side, you can see, so normally when you see a graph about greenhouse gases, it will be carbon dioxide equivalents, just to kind of make it easy to understand. But you can see that some of those gases there are actually much more potent greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is bad enough, but methane, for example, is at least 28 times worse than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide, 265 times worse than carbon dioxide. Hydrofluorocarbons, which are the gases that you have in refrigerating and air conditioning units, are 12,500 times worse than 1 kilo of carbon dioxide. Perfluorocarbons, 16,000 times worse. And nitrogen trifluoride, 17,000 times worse. So what happens is normally when you see a graph that talks to you about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or greenhouse gases, it'll have a little E at the bottom of it. It'll say CO2e. The equivalent means that they've run through and made an equation to make it equal to 1 litre of carbon dioxide. I think the closest table we've got to that is probably this one. So you can see, I mean, those other gases are much smaller, the emissions of those gases is much less. Yeah, but the reactivity is much higher. I think one of the reasons that it's important to know about this table is there are lots and lots of things that we can do to reduce our emissions, and sometimes people don't realise just how significant something that seems fairly minor, like, turning your air conditioning unit down or even off, makes a massive difference. Because air conditioning units use hydrofluorocarbons, which are 12,500 times worse than carbon dioxide. So, or refrigeration is the same. I keep walking into supermarkets in the Mosman area and seeing these open refrigerating units and freaking out about it every time I see one, because I know that that's what's going on. So we'll come back to that. I'm going to leave that slide up because I think it could help to inform, what we might want to be thinking about when we have our discussion. So I haven't gone into great detail about the global to the local, but I do want to just touch on a few things. So you probably mostly have heard of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement followed the Kyoto Agreement. So the Kyoto Agreement came to an end in 2020, and the Paris Agreement was to set up a new protocol. Australia has committed to the Paris Agreement, but it has made one of the weakest commitments of any other nation in the world. So Australia has agreed to 28% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Most of the rest of the world are aiming at about net zero by 2050 at the outside, at the very, very outside. So not 25% to 28%, but zero by just a decade or two later. The IPCC, again, if you're in this field, then you need to know about the IPCC. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they are funded by the United Nations and the World Meteorological Society together. And what they do is every 7 years they bring together all the scientific data that's happened in the previous 7 years across any part of the climate change spectrum, including economics and social change, and they collate it all together into one enormous report. They're very conservative, actually. They don't tend to go for sort of outlier bits of science. So you have to bear in mind that when you read the IPCC, what you're reading is a very conservative document, but they are the go-to for what's happening in terms of climate change around the world. And the IPCC last year produced a new report where they said that 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels of global temperature, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's the average across the entire planet. 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is extremely dangerous. And the politicians have been using 2 degrees, so they've been using 2 degrees as a goal up until last year. And what the IPCC is saying is that that is beyond the pale dangerous. So at 1.5 degrees, we're likely to lose something like 50% of species around the world at 1.5 degrees. At 2 degrees, you're looking at, an extinction level that's almost, well, we don't know. There's a lot of unknowns, even with all the science that takes place. Yeah. So right now, we are between 1 and 1.1 degrees higher on average than pre-industrial levels. And actually, just to, let me come back very quickly to this one. So this shows you the pre-industrial terrain. And what you can see, what I would normally say is that parts per million volume, so right now we're at 416 parts per million volume, I would usually say on average before the Industrial Revolution, the parts per million volume are 280. And that's safe. That's perfectly safe. That's just the natural ebb and flow of the planet. And there are many ways in which the planet varies climatically normally. You can see that it's a cycle, it's cyclic. And I can go into a lot of detail about that if you want me to, but perhaps not in this venue. But you can actually see from that 280 parts per million volume is the top of the range. It's not the average of the range, it's the top of the range. So for us to go from 280 parts per million volume to 416 in 200 years is unprecedented, and it's extreme. It's very, very extreme. Right, so I wanted to come, from the global down to Australia. So as I said before, one of the problems with Australia is that the federal government have not been very keen to make binding referenda. So they have joined the Paris Agreement, but they haven't really been particularly keen on really leading the climate policy and climate initiative. But you can see here that the various different states in Australia have, in some cases anyway, created targets that the federal government hasn't yet themselves really created. So you can see that there are 3 states that are well beyond where we are in New South Wales, in fact 5, Tasmania, South Australia. People have to help me because I'm not Australian, so ACT is, what's that? Canberra. Canberra, I was getting a bit lost there. And New South Wales is kicking off, and is actually kicking off very quickly, and there's no reason why we need to stay in that starting block position for very long. We can actually really make things move very quickly once we've decided to do it, and we have decided to do it. So that's where we are at the moment, but we're not going to stay there long. This is again a very technical slide, and I don't want to spend too much time here unless you really want me to. But the way that we measure greenhouse gases is Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3. Now Scope 1 is very easy to have direct impact on. Scope 1 is what you do. It's whether you jump in your car and go for a drive or not. It's whether you book a flight or not. So Scope 1 is very much about your own actions. Scope 2 and 3 are the background emissions that are embedded in things like your power. So you may turn on the switch, you have control over whether or not to turn the air conditioner unit on or off. But once you do turn the air conditioner unit on or off, you either belong to a power company that uses coal or you belong to a power company that uses renewables. That's Scope 2. So again, you do have some control over that because you can change power company. And Scope 3 is what you might call the circular economy. So that's the carbon emissions that are embedded in things like, if you're thinking about the car, the car is made of rolled steel. The steel has to be mined from the ground, it has to be smelted, it has to be rolled, and then it gets turned into a car carcass, right? The body of the car. All of those things involve emissions. So those emissions are embedded in anything you buy, whether it be a pound of butter, a car, clothing, anything you buy has got emissions that are embedded in it. And there are a whole lot of things in which you might not even think about emissions. So for example, we turn on our computer, immediately we're using power, that's involving emissions. The computer itself has got a whole lot of emissions that are embedded in the article itself. So those are all Scope 3. And that's to do with the circular economy. And I kind of want to go into the circular economy a little bit because I think it's going to be increasingly important, the circular economy. So the circular economy, the idea is that you pay attention to the process of any particular article that you might buy on the marketplace from its inception, from its design to the mining that gets the materials that it's made from, to the process that it goes into to actually make that article, to the transportation. So if, for example, this is made in China, then it has to jump on a ship and get here. That involves a whole lot of carbon emissions. And then there'll be carbon emissions in distributing it throughout Australia. And then what do we do? So you use it for a number of years. What happens when it's, dead? Can you strip it out? Can you take the various bits of highly valuable metal out of this piece of equipment? Is that an easy thing to do or not? So it all comes down to the design. So the circular economy is cradle to cradle. The idea is there is no grave. All right, so at the moment what we have is cradle to grave production, and it just goes into the landfill. Well, everybody knows that landfill is very, very, very problematic now, particularly because China no longer takes our rubbish, so we're having to fill our own landfill. And that landfill creates a lot of emissions in the rotting down of some of the stuff. Plus, there's a lot of toxic material in something like a laptop. And that toxic material is actually very valuable. So you can reuse it if you design it properly so that you can access the materials back out of it again. So the circular economy is cradle to cradle design. And the idea is that increasingly we will be able to monitor and account for all of the emissions at every point along that process, that production process. So that's scope 3. At the moment, it's very difficult to do, but there's a lot of call happening out in the world to make it much more transparent. All right, so this is Australian emissions. You can see here that electricity in Australia is a huge source of emissions. Now, I'm from New Zealand. You wouldn't have a graph like that in New Zealand because most of the electricity in New Zealand is made from renewables. It's hydro or it's natural heat, thermo heat. But the reason it's so high here is because most of the electricity generation is from coal. So I think that's one of the things to bear in mind. That's the most obvious one. And there's a lot of things up there that don't really impact on Mosman, so we'll get to Mosman. Oh, this is the projection. This is emissions projections based on current policy. So the green line there is what will happen if we just continue with current policy at federal level. And the yellow dotted line is what the IPCC are suggesting is very, very important, is to come down to net zero by 2030. So that's come from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is Mosman's emissions, and you can see that residential emissions make up by far the bulk, almost 70% of emissions in this local authority. That's because we don't have heavy industry in Mosman. So most of the emissions is coming from various different residential areas. And that means it's a good thing because we can do a lot about it. So the council had a council meeting in July and have agreed to a target of net zero by 2030 for the council. And what we will be talking about today is net zero, an aspirational target for the community of net zero by 2040. So that's 20 years to bring down emissions in the residential part of the community and the commercial part. So the Mosman Council has its own operations. It's like a big organisation within this area. And because so the council, so for example, this building here is a council building, and it has quite a lot of emissions coming from this particular building. So the council has said that they will reduce the emissions of the council operations by 2030. Not the schools, no, because the schools don't belong to the council. The schools belong to the schools. So the schools will be in that non-residential 30% there. Their emissions are part of that. So the council is going to do a whole lot of things to encourage other organisations as well as the residents within Mosman to reduce emissions. So for example, we have a few things that we've been doing with schools, Solar My Schools, helping the schools put solar panels on the roof. And at the moment we've got a little enterprise which is called Climate Clever, which is an app that the schools can use, and the app helps show them, it's an analysis of where their emissions are. And so they can use that analysis, and the kids get involved. The whole idea is that it involves the entire school community, and they can identify what will bring their emissions down. And schools are actually really making good use of this app and bringing down their power bills, so it helps save them money, and it also helps them emit a lot less. So the council will definitely be taking a leading role in all of that, but that's quite different from the organisation of the council, which is directly responsible for specific emissions that the organisation creates. 55% electricity, 38% transport, 10% waste and gas. We're just about to have a look at some of Resilience Sydney's data. So they've got a lovely map, which we'll show you in a sec, which does make a bit of a comparison between Mosman and the other suburbs in Sydney. And what you'll see is that Mosman's definitely not the worst. There's other areas of Sydney which are got higher per capita emissions. So this is, you can see the map there. The red is the worst, right? So the redder it is, the higher the emissions per capita are. Per capita means per household, basically, or per person per household. And Mosman's not too bad. So it's 10.8 tonnes per person per year. That's come down, actually. So Australia used to be 15 tonnes per person per year, which was one of the worst in the world. We're now at third worst in the world. So we're not exactly, we don't have a lot to celebrate yet. But on the other hand, we have a lot of low-hanging fruit. It's going to be quite easy to reduce. Yep. And part of the reason why some of these other wards are higher is because that's where the industrial areas are. So it's a little bit duplicitous for us to take credit for Mosman somehow being much better than other areas, given that that's where the industrial areas are and it's not in Mosman. So you're really just, because 3/4 of the emissions in Mosman is residential, you're not comparing apples with apples. Yep. So although those emissions are coming from some of these other areas, these industrial emissions, the Mosman people are definitely benefiting from all the emissions that are happening in those other areas. So it's, this is the thing that happens whenever you do data with climate change. It's always problematic. You always have to look at what are you comparing what with, whether you're looking at CO2 equivalents or whether you're looking at specific gases can make quite a big difference. And, what's getting counted and what's being left out. So those carbon calculators are really good, but they are quite arduous for people to put everything in. You have to basically get your power bill and feed in everything from your power bill into a carbon calculator. But if you want to do that for your household, it's a very useful way of understanding exactly where your emissions are. But so the council has just made a partnership with Climate Clever, which is the app that I was just talking about in relation to schools, and we are making it available to all the households in Mosman at half price, which is $15 a year, $16.50 a year. And it's a fantastic app. It's really user-friendly. So it's one of these carbon calculators, but it's a very detailed one, and it's quite exciting. You get to see what your emissions have been, and then you follow they have a few really good tips of how you can reduce emissions in your household, and then you get to see the benefits of that really quickly and immediately. So I'd fully recommend that you jump on the website, and we've made a link, and that link will give you this half price access to this app, and it's fun and it's good. It's a good learning curve too, because it helps teach people in your family to switch off and things like that. I'm refraining from putting up slides about all the various different ways in which emissions show up in our daily lives, but I think this one is really quite good because it shows you how much emissions are involved in driving a car. And so I know that there's been quite a lot of enthusiasm for electric vehicles in Mosman, which is good. You can see that electric vehicles produce a little bit less emissions than an ordinary car. But they're probably on a par. Like if you have a small petrol vehicle as opposed to an electric vehicle, they're probably almost the same emissions. So don't get too swept up with the idea that electric cars reduce an enormous amount. Yes, it does. It does, absolutely. So if you're getting your electricity, if you're getting your electricity from a coal-based electricity power station, you're not really saving very much at all. If you're lucky enough to get it from renewables, and unfortunately, Sydney's not well served by renewables yet. And then I think one of the things that really struck me anyway with this graph is that public transport, whether it be popular or unpopular, public transport is vastly less emissions than any kind of private vehicle. So it's kind of worth remembering that. And of course, in the days of COVID, it's more difficult than ever to use public transport. This is basically if all the ice from Antarctica and Greenland slides off into the ocean, we get a 7-metre sea level rise. And Sydney's fairly, rocky and quite steep, so it's probably not going to be as badly off as some of the other areas, like Florida, for example, will be completely underwater. Bangladesh will be completely underwater. So when we're thinking about Australia warming, you also need to bear in mind that there's 300 million people living in Bangladesh and they will be swimming and they have to swim somewhere. So, there'll be a lot of climate refugee movement that's already taking place and it will be getting worse.